The ancient stones of Dunwich seemed perpetually damp, exuding a miasma of decay that clung to the very air, an invisible, intangible dust of forgotten epochs. Ilara Thorne, a woman whose practical spirit had hitherto resisted the pervasive melancholy of the valley, found herself increasingly susceptible to its subtle influence, particularly as the autumnal mists began their inexorable creep down the slopes of Sentinel Hill. As a palliative care nurse, her days were spent amidst the dwindling embers of human life, a profession that, in Dunwich, often felt less like healing and more like a vigil in the antechamber of something far older and less comprehensible than mere death. The local lore, often whispered in hushed tones by the elder folk, spoke of the Whippoorwills, those nocturnal harbingers whose melancholic cries were said to time their cadence precisely to the moment a soul fled its mortal coil, catching it on its sorrowful journey into the beyond. Ilara had always dismissed such notions as the quaint if morbid poetry of a people deeply entwined with their rugged, isolated landscape. Her current charge was Elias Thorne, no relation, but a name often recurring in the genealogical labyrinth of Dunwich, a man whose centennial grip on life was finally loosening. His domicile, a decrepit farmhouse perched precariously on a slope overlooking a particularly desolate stretch of forest, seemed itself to be expiring. Its timbers groaned with a senile weariness, and its windows, like cataract-stricken eyes, stared blankly at the encroaching shadows. It was there, amidst the cloying scent of liniment and impending dissolution, that Ilara first noted the anomaly. The Whippoorwills, of course, had always been present. Their mournful ululations were as much a part of Dunwich nights as the rustling of dry leaves and the distant, unsettling sigh of the wind through the pines. But typically their chorus would swell as death's cold breath grew nearer, a natural accompaniment to the solemn passage. Yet with Elias the pattern began to subtly diverge. She arrived one evening, the sky still bruised with twilight, to find not a handful of birds, but a veritable congregation of them perched upon the gnarled branches of the oak that overhung Elias's bedroom window. Their calls, usually spaced and forlorn, were now a denser, more insistent thrum, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to anticipate rather than merely respond. Elias, meanwhile, was no worse than usual, perhaps even a fraction more lucid, his ancient eyes possessing a momentary startling clarity as he murmured about the chirpings outside, an unfamiliar anxiety etching itself into his withered face. Ilara, a woman of science and practicality, initially sought mundane explanations. Perhaps an abundant insect population had drawn them, or perhaps the old man's own declining state was more pronounced than she observed. Yet the memory of that unnerving congregation lingered, a tiny splinter in the smooth surface of her rational world-view. A fortnight later, another instance solidified her disquiet. Old Man Hemlock, a solitary woodsman from the valley's northern reaches, suffered a sudden, catastrophic stroke. Ilara, called to his remote cabin by a frantic neighbour, found the scene already besieged. Not by paramedics, but by the Whippoorwills. Hundreds of them, it seemed, cloaked the skeletal trees surrounding the dwelling, their cries a ceaseless, unnerving mantra that vibrated through the very panes of the windows. And Hemlock, still clinging to life in a paralytic agony, seemed to be struggling not just against his failing body, but against some unseen tether that sought to pull him from within. His eyes, wide with a terror that transcended physical pain, darted towards the windows, towards the relentless chorus, as if acknowledging a formidable adversary. This was not the gentle, mournful passing of a soul, but a siege. The rational mind, when confronted with the uncanny, often erects bastions of denial. Ilara tried. She attributed it to coincidence, to heightened awareness brought on by stress. Yet the images gnawed at her, the preternatural concentration of the birds, their unnervingly purposeful demeanour, the palpable dread emanating from the dying. She began to observe more closely, her duties as a nurse now overlaid with an unsought, morbid reconnaissance. She noticed a pattern. Not every dying soul in Dunwich drew such an intense congregation, only certain ones. Those of profound isolation, perhaps, or those whose lives had touched upon the valley's deeper, less charted currents. And crucially, the birds always arrived before the final, irreversible decline, sometimes even before the patient showed definitive signs of immediate mortality. It was as if they were scouts, assessing the ripeness of the fruit, marking a particular soul for an expedited journey. The Whippoorwills were not just passive observers, but active participants, perhaps even orchestrators. The air in Dunwich felt denser, laden with the weight of this nascent, chilling suspicion. Ilara found herself drawn to the archives of the Dunwich Historical Society, a dusty, ill-lit chamber filled with the forgotten ephemera of generations. She pored over faded journals, archaic land deeds, and collections of local folklore, seeking an explanation beyond the simple, comforting myth. She discovered references, fragmented and cryptic, to the chorus of the dead, a phrase found in a particularly tattered diary from the early 18th century, penned by a certain Reverend Josiah Babcock, a man whose later entries devolved into raving madness and theological despair. Babcock wrote of the Whippoorwills not as guides, but as hounds of the nether vaults, agents of those from beyond the spheres. He spoke of a maw, an ever-hungry emptiness that lurked at the fringes of their reality, fed by the vital essence of departing souls. "They do not guide," Babcock had scrawled in a hand that trembled with more than age, "but entrap. They form a cage of lamentations that the spirit might not ascend, but be drawn down, down to that which hungers in the cyclopean voids beyond the stars." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The archaic language, the horrifying implication, it resonated with a primal dread that bypassed her intellect and struck directly at the core of her being. The Whippoorwills were not merely catching souls, they were herding them, corralling them into some unimaginable cosmic abattoir. The Old Ones, as Babcock had obliquely referred to them, were not just distant entities but active predators. And Dunwich, with its peculiar energies and isolation, was a hunting ground. The revelation twisted her nights into waking nightmares, her days into a constant vigil against the encroaching truth. She saw the familiar landscape of Dunwich with new, terrifying eyes. The crumbling stone walls seemed less rustic and more like ancient cyclopean bones. The mists less benign and more like the ethereal emanations of something vast and indifferent. The very air seemed to hum with unseen currents, the resonance of a world not quite aligned with her mundane understanding. Then came the summons from the Akeley residence. Mrs. Abigail Akeley, a spinster of advanced years, resided in a rambling Gothic revival monstrosity on the edge of the darkest woods, a place reputedly avoided even by the most hardened Dunwich natives. She was not terminally ill, merely frail, requiring consistent care. Ilara had visited her before, noting the peculiar silence of the surrounding woods. No birdsong, no rustling of creatures. It was a place where sound itself seemed to be absorbed. Upon her arrival, however, the silence had been violently broken. The air was thick with it. The guttural, insistent chorus of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of whippoorwills. They blanketed the ancient oak trees, darkened the sky as they circled in agitated spirals, and perched upon every gabled peak and chimney stack of the Akeley house. Their cries were no longer mournful. They were a frenzied, cacophonous shriek, a tangible wave of sonic malevolence that seemed to buffet the very structure. Inside, Mrs. Akeley lay in her vast four-poster bed, her eyes wide with a terror that eclipsed mere senility. She was lucid, horrifyingly so. "They are here, child," she whispered, her voice a reedy rasp. "They are come for me. They knew, they always know." Her frail hand clutched Ilara's arm with a strength that belied her age. "They pick at the windows, do you hear? Trying to get in, trying to pry the very spirit from me." Ilara looked. The window panes, though seemingly intact, vibrated with a faint, incessant thrum. Outside, the avian horde intensified its assault. Shadows of their darting bodies flickered across the glass, and Ilara could almost swear she heard a faint, persistent tap, 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 like tiny, insistent beaks testing the strength of the barrier. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was a siege, a concerted, intelligent assault. The birds were not simply awaiting death. They were actively trying to force it, to pry the soul from its earthly vessel before its time, perhaps for a more potent, more succulent feast. A horrifying realization dawned upon Ilara. Mrs. Akeley was not yet truly sick. Her frailty was general, not acute. The whippoorwills had swarmed before the immediate onset of death. They were not merely harvesters. They were cultivators, instigators. They were here to ensure Mrs. Akeley's soul was plucked, pristine and struggling, for the unholy banquet of the old ones. Fear, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, pierced Ilara's professional detachment. This was not about comfort care. It was about protecting a soul from an unfathomable cosmic predation. "Mrs. Akeley," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands, "we will keep you safe. We will not let them in." She spoke with a conviction she scarcely felt, but it seemed to calm the old woman marginally. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, plunging the valley into a profound darkness, a darkness made all the more absolute by the ceaseless infernal chorus of the whippoorwills. The air grew thick with their unseen bodies, their wing beats a thunderous whisper against the night. The sound was no longer just auditory, it was physical, a pressure on the eardrums, a vibration in the chest. Ilara moved quickly, drawing every curtain, securing every latch. She brought every lamp and candle into Mrs. Akeley's room, hoping the light would be a deterrent, a fragile bulwark against the encroaching shadow. But the light seemed only to delineate the terrifying silhouettes of the birds outside, their eyes pinpricks of infernal luminescence, glinting in the darkness. The incessant pecking against the windows began in earnest. Not just a sporadic tap, but a coordinated rhythmic assault. Thousands of tiny beaks, like minute hammers, hammered against the glass. The old panes, already fragile, groaned and flexed, spiderweb cracks beginning to propagate from the points of impact. It was not mere pecking for attention. It was a methodical, destructive effort, a patient, terrifying attempt to breach the boundary between worlds. Mrs. Akeley began to whimper, her eyes fixed on the windows, on the terrible unseen force that sought to penetrate. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged, her frail body convulsing with an ancient terror. Ilara knew that the psychological strain alone could kill her, could sever the tenuous thread of life and deliver her soul into the waiting maw. Ilara, driven by a desperate primordial instinct, grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from the bedside table. She knew it was futile against such a multitude, but she had to do something. She began striking the window frames, hoping to scare them off, to create a counter-noise, anything to disrupt their horrific rhythm. The clatter of brass against wood was a pathetic counterpoint to the overwhelming chorus outside, but it gave her a focal point for her terror, a tangible enemy to confront. One pane, a particularly ancient one, gave a sharp, sickening crack. A small, jagged hole appeared, and immediately a flurry of tiny dark bodies surged towards it, their cries now a triumphant shriek. Ilara screamed, plunging the candelabra into the breach, striking blindly, feeling the sickening impact of bone and feather. The smell of something acrid and ancient, like dust from a forgotten tomb, wafted into the room. She fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed, driven by the horrifying realization of the stakes. This was not just about Mrs. Akeley. It was about the fundamental sanctity of life and death, about preventing an unspeakable cosmic violation. She imagined the souls, trapped, screaming into the void, feeding something that should not be. She tore a heavy tapestry from the wall, a moth-eaten depiction of a pastoral scene that seemed ludicrously out of place now, and shoved it against the shattered pane, desperately trying to block the breach. But other cracks were appearing, other panes were bowing under the relentless concentrated pressure. Mrs. Akeley's whimpers had faded to a low, continuous moan. Her grip on Ilara's hand was slackening. Her eyes were still wide, but now they seemed to stare past Ilara, past the windows, into some inner abyss. She was fading, not just from natural causes, but from the sheer, overwhelming terror. Ilara felt the house itself beginning to creak and sway, not from wind, but from the immense focused energy directed at it. The very timbers seemed to be shrinking from the assault. She looked around, desperate for anything. Her gaze fell upon an old, unused fireplace, its flue long since sealed. An idea, half-formed and wholly desperate, sparked in her mind. "Mrs. Akeley!" she yelled, her voice raw, trying to rouse the old woman. "We need to move you! We need to go!" But Mrs. Akeley was barely conscious. Her breathing was now shallow, sporadic. Her chest barely rose. The whippoorwills outside knew. Their cries reached a crescendo, a final, exultant symphony of doom. Ilara knew she had only moments. With the strength born of pure adrenaline and primal fear, she dragged the frail body of Mrs. Akeley from the bed. She half-carried, half-pulled her towards the unused fireplace, its cold, dark maw, a symbol of both escape and finality. She remembered old tales of witches, of spirits using chimneys as passages. It was a desperate, illogical gamble, but what other choice was there? She wrenched open the heavy iron screen, revealing the soot-stained brickwork. The air within was stale, thick with the smell of old smoke and something else, something ancient and earthy. The whippoorwills outside sensed her intention. Their assault intensified on the window closest to the fireplace, as if they understood her desperate ploy, understood that the chimney might offer a path out for the soul, a path they could not easily follow or block. With a final gargantuan effort, Ilara pushed Mrs. Akeley's body into the opening of the fireplace, guiding her head first, hoping to slide her through the narrow passage. The old woman was barely conscious, her body limp and unresponsive. The pecking at the windows became a frantic, desperate scrabbling. A whole pane shattered with a deafening crash, and the room was instantly filled with the frenzied flapping of wings, the shriek of hundreds of birds swarming inward, their eyes blazing with an unholy hunger. Ilara screamed, shoving the rest of Mrs. Akeley's body into the chimney, using her own back to push, feeling the rough brick scrape against her. She heard the horrifying rush of tiny bodies behind her, the piercing cries, the sudden sharp pain as beaks and claws raked her exposed skin. But she didn't stop. She pushed and pushed until Mrs. Akeley's form was fully within the dark, vertical shaft. Then, with a shudder that went through the very foundations of the house, a sudden, profound silence descended. The cacophony of the birds ceased as abruptly as if a conductor had lowered his baton. The frenzied flapping stopped. The silence was absolute, heavier and more terrifying than any noise. The few birds that had breached the window seemed frozen, their tiny malevolent eyes fixed on the empty fireplace. Ilara, panting, bleeding, slumped against the cold stone hearth. She had pushed Mrs. Akeley into the chimney. Had she found escape, or merely a different kind of oblivion? She didn't know, but the birds had retreated. Their malevolent energy had dissipated. She felt for Mrs. Akeley's pulse, knowing even as she reached that it would be gone. The old woman was gone. Her body was a lifeless shell, half-lodged in the grimy chimney. But her face, even in death, held a strange, serene emptiness. The terror was gone. Her eyes were closed. Ilara collapsed to the floor, the metallic tang of blood filling her mouth. The silence in the room was crushing. She looked at the shattered window, at the gaping hole where hundreds of birds had clamoured. They were gone. The air outside was still. The house still groaned, but now it was a sound of ancient weariness, not active siege. She had lost the patient. Mrs. Akeley was dead. But perhaps, just perhaps, she had saved her soul from an unimaginable fate. The sun eventually rose, painting the Dunwich hills with a deceptive, tranquil beauty. Ilara Thorne emerged from the Akeley house, a changed woman. Her skin was lacerated, her clothes torn, but it was the look in her eyes that was truly altered. The practical nurse was gone, replaced by a prophet of dread, a witness to unspeakable cosmic truths. She had peered into the void, glimpsed the ravenous maw of the old ones, and understood their ancient hunger, fed by the stolen souls of the unsuspecting. The whippoorwills still cried in the Dunwich nights, but now, to Ilara, their lamentations were no longer sorrowful. They were a chorus of the damned, a song of cosmic predation, a ceaseless reminder of the invisible, horrifying truth that lurked just beyond the veil of sanity, eternally vigilant, eternally hungry. She knew now that the souls of Dunwich were not merely passing on. They were being harvested, and she, a lone, insignificant human, bore the terrible burden of that knowledge. The world was not as it seemed, and the dark abyssal truth had only just begun to unfurl itself.